Conservative father rejects gay son. Old photos reveal a shocking past that changes everything. Hello, welcome. Leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy this story. The air was thick with tension as Henry sat in the dimly lit room, his hands trembling as he clutched a letter he was never meant to find. The words on the page felt like a punch to the gut, words that shattered the world he thought he knew. How could something so small, so simple, unravel everything? The silence in the house was deafening, but inside Henry, a storm was raging. The kind of storm that brings everything crashing down. Michael had always tried to be the son his father wanted. A dutiful, respectful young man who never questioned the rigid rules that defined their household. But secrets have a way of slipping through the cracks, no matter how hard you try to bury them. And now, as Michael walked through the door, completely unaware of the tempest about to hit, Henry was left with a choice. A choice that would change both their lives forever. In that brief moment, as father and son locked eyes, the weight of years of silence and hidden truths hung between them like a thick fog. Henry's heart pounded with a mix of fear, anger, and something else. Something he couldn't quite name. But as the shadows of the past began to creep into the present, one thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same again. It was a bitterly cold winter afternoon in a small town nestled in the heartland of America. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet, snow-covered streets. The wind howled softly, rattling the bare branches of the trees and sending dry leaves skittering across the frozen ground. Inside one of the modest, well-kept homes in a traditional neighborhood, a storm was brewing that no one could see. Henry Thompson, a man in his mid-50s, sat at the kitchen table, his broad shoulders slumped as if carrying the weight of the world. His usually stern, stoic face was now a mask of disbelief and anguish. In his trembling hands, he held a letter, its edges worn and the ink slightly smudged from the repeated reading. The letter, though short, was filled with the kind of truth that shatters illusions and turns a life upside down. The ticking of the old clock on the wall seemed deafening in the silence of the room. Henry's breath came in short, uneven gasps as he struggled to process the words on the page. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a painful reminder of the reality he couldn't escape. The letter was not meant for him. It was a private confession from his son, Michael, to a close friend, a heartfelt expression of the pain and loneliness that had been Michael's constant companions for years. Michael, who had just turned 22, had written about the secret he had kept hidden for so long, the secret that he knew would devastate his father if ever discovered. Henry's hands shook as he reread the opening lines. "Dear Jake, I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. Pretending to be someone I'm not is killing me. I've been living a lie for so long, trying to be the son my father wants. But the truth is, I'm gay. I know he'll never accept me for who I am. And that thought alone breaks my heart every single day." The words blurred as tears welled up in Henry's eyes, but he blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. He had always prided himself on being a man of principle, a man who upheld the traditional values he was raised with. In his mind, there was no room for deviation, no space for what he considered weakness. But now, faced with the undeniable truth about his only son, Henry felt as if the ground beneath him was crumbling. His mind raced, a torrent of conflicting emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Anger, confusion, and a deep-seated fear clashed within him, each demanding his attention. Why hadn't Michael told him? Why had his son chosen to confide in someone else, to pour out his heart on paper instead of coming to him? Was it because Michael feared his reaction, knew that he wouldn't be accepted, that he might even be cast out? The thought stung, but Henry pushed it aside, replacing it with a cold, hard resolve. In a sudden, almost violent motion, Henry tore the letter into pieces, the sound of the ripping paper echoing in the empty kitchen. He threw the fragments into the trash can, his chest heaving with the effort to control the storm raging inside him. As he stood there, staring at the remnants of the letter, the front door creaked open. Michael stepped inside, shaking the cold from his jacket and stamping his boots on the mat. He looked up, his blue eyes meeting his father's from across the room. In that brief moment, the air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken words, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Henry didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His expression, hard, cold, and unreadable, spoke volumes. Michael's smile faltered, his heart sinking as he sensed that something was terribly wrong. The usual warmth in his father's eyes was gone, replaced by a chilling indifference that sent a shiver down Michael's spine. Silence hung heavy in the room as Michael hesitated, his gaze drifting to the kitchen counter where he noticed something out of place. A small piece of paper, crumpled and torn, lay near the edge of the trash can. He took a step closer, his breath catching in his throat as recognition dawned. The color drained from Michael's face as he pieced together what had happened. The letter, the one he had written in a moment of desperation, was no longer hidden. His father had found it, read it, and now knew everything. Panic surged through him, but he forced himself to stay calm, to act as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. "Dad." Michael's voice was barely a whisper, thick with fear and uncertainty. He wanted to explain, to somehow make things right, but the words wouldn't come. His father's cold, distant stare cut through him like a knife, leaving him feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way he had never experienced before. Henry turned away, his jaw clenched tight as he fought to keep his emotions in check. He couldn't look at his son, not now. Not with the anger and disappointment swirling within him. He needed time to think, to process what he had learned, but more than anything, he needed distance. Without a word, Henry walked out of the kitchen, leaving Michael standing alone, the weight of the unshed tears heavy in the air. As the door to his father's study closed with a soft click, Michael felt the sting of rejection settle deep in his chest. He swallowed hard, his throat burning as he forced himself to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. The house was quiet once more, but the silence was now filled with an unbearable tension. Michael stared at the closed door, his heart aching with a pain he had never known. He knew in that moment that the bond between him and his father had been shattered, perhaps beyond repair. And yet he couldn't cry. The tears that should have come, the release that he so desperately needed, remained locked away, hidden behind a wall of fear and uncertainty. The unshed tears lingered, a silent testament to the storm that had just begun to brew within the Thompson household. The night settled over the town like a thick, suffocating blanket. The biting cold of winter seeped through the walls of the Thompson home, but inside, it was not the chill that gripped the hearts of its occupants. It was the silence, a silence so profound that it felt as though the very air had been drained of life. Michael lay on his bed, staring up at the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't quiet. The confrontation with his father, or rather the lack of it, had left him feeling hollow. He had always feared this moment, the day his secret would be exposed, but he had never imagined it would happen this way. The look in his father's eyes, the cold indifference, haunted him. He had always known that Henry wouldn't understand, but the sheer absence of any emotion other than disappointment and anger was more than he could bear. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, but Michael didn't move. He knew it was probably Jake, checking in on him as he often did, but Michael couldn't bring himself to answer. What could he say? That his father now knew the truth? That everything he had feared had come to pass? The weight of it all was too much, pressing down on him, suffocating him. Downstairs, Henry sat in his study, the room dimly lit by the glow of a single lamp. The letter was gone, but its contents were seared into his memory, replaying over and over in his mind like a broken record. He sat behind his desk, a glass of bourbon in hand, staring blankly at the wall. The warmth of the alcohol did little to calm his nerves, and the bitterness of its taste seemed to mirror the bitterness in his heart. Henry had always prided himself on being a man of strong principles, a pillar of the community, respected and admired by those around him. But now, he felt as though the foundation of his life had been shaken, the ground beneath him uncertain. How had things come to this? How had his own son, the boy he had raised with such care and discipline, ended up so far from the path Henry had set for him? He thought back to his own upbringing, the strictness of his father, the rigid moral code that had been drilled into him from a young age. There was no room for deviation, no tolerance for weakness. Henry had learned early on that the world was a harsh place, and only the strong, the disciplined, survived. He had carried those lessons into his own family, raising Michael with the same firm hand, expecting nothing less than perfection. But now, sitting alone in the darkness, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere along the way, he had failed. The thought gnawed at him, a persistent, unwelcome intruder in his mind. Had he been too harsh? Too unyielding? Was there something he could have done differently? Some way he could have guided Michael back onto the right path? The questions were endless, each one more painful than the last. But Henry had no answers. All he had was the silence, the emptiness that filled his home and his heart. He had spent his life building a wall around himself, a fortress of rules and expectations. But now, in the face of his son's revelation, that wall felt more like a prison. The sound of the front door opening and closing brought Henry out of his thoughts. He listened as Michael's footsteps echoed through the hall, growing fainter as he made his way to the door. Henry's grip on the glass tightened, his knuckles turning white as he fought the urge to get up, to stop his son from leaving. But he didn't move. He couldn't. Michael stepped outside into the frigid night air, his breath visible in the cold as he walked down the snow-covered path. He didn't know where he was going, only that he couldn't stay in that house any longer. The weight of his father's disappointment was too much to bear, and the silence between them too loud. As he walked, his mind drifted back to the times when he was younger, when his father's approval meant everything to him. He had always strived to be the perfect son, to live up to the expectations that Henry had set for him. But no matter how hard he tried, there was always a part of him that he couldn't change, a part that he knew would never be enough for his father. He reached the end of the street and turned, heading towards Jake's house. Jake had been his lifeline for as long as he could remember, the one person he could talk to about anything. But tonight, even Jake couldn't help him. The pain was too raw, the wounds too fresh. All he wanted was to be anywhere but home, anywhere but in the shadow of his father's judgment. As he walked, the town around him seemed almost surreal, the familiar streets and houses transformed by the night into something alien and cold. The snow crunched beneath his feet, the only sound in the stillness of the night. It felt as though the world had shrunk down to just him, alone in the darkness, with nothing but his thoughts for company. At Jake's house, the lights were still on. Michael stood at the edge of the driveway, hesitating. He knew Jake would welcome him in, no questions asked, but he wasn't sure he could face his friend right now. The shame of it all was too overwhelming. He didn't want to see the pity in Jake's eyes, didn't want to hear the well-meaning words of comfort. He just wanted to disappear, to vanish into the night and leave all the pain behind. But there was no escaping it. The pain was inside him, a part of him, just as much as the truth he had been forced to confront. He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs, and turned away from the house. He would go somewhere else, anywhere else. Somewhere he could be alone with his thoughts, where he didn't have to pretend that everything was okay. Back at the Thompson house, Henry sat in the darkness, the silence pressing in on him from all sides. He knew Michael had left, could feel the absence of his presence in the house as keenly as if a light had been extinguished. But still, he couldn't bring himself to go after him. The weight of his own guilt, his own fear, kept him rooted in place. The bourbon in his glass was gone, but the bitterness remained, a reminder of the rift that had opened up between him and his son. A rift that, in his heart, he feared might never be mended. He had always believed that he was doing what was right, that he was protecting his family by holding them to the highest standards. But now, as he sat alone in the dark, he couldn't help but wonder if he had been wrong. The silence in the house deepened, a void that seemed to swallow everything in its path. And in that silence, both Henry and Michael were left to grapple with their own demons, each one struggling to find a way forward in the darkness that had descended upon their lives. The early morning light filtered through the curtains of Henry's study, casting long shadows across the room. But the dawn brought no comfort, only a harsh reminder of the night that had passed. Henry had slept little, his mind too restless to allow him peace. The quiet of the house, usually a refuge, now felt oppressive, a constant reminder of the chasm that had opened between him and his son. He sat at his desk, fingers tracing the edge of an old photo album that had been tucked away for years, buried beneath layers of forgotten memories. He hadn't intended to find it, but in his sleepless state, something had driven him to search through the boxes in his closet, as if the past might hold answers to the turmoil he was feeling now. The leather cover of the album was worn and cracked with age, the corners frayed from years of handling. Henry hesitated, his hand hovering over the clasp, as if opening it might unleash something he wasn't ready to face. But the urge was too strong, a compulsion he couldn't resist. With a deep breath, he unfastened the clasp and opened the album. The pages were yellowed, the photographs faded, but the images they held were still clear enough to stir memories long buried. As he turned the pages, Henry was confronted with the ghost of his younger self. A boy who had once been full of dreams and desires that he had long since learned to suppress. The photos were of a different time, a different world. A young Henry, not much older than Michael was now, stared back at him from the page. The boy in the pictures had the same strong jawline, the same intense eyes, but there was a softness to his expression, a vulnerability that had long since been hardened by life's trials. And there, among the photos of family gatherings and school events, was a picture that made Henry's breath catch in his throat. It was a photo of him and another boy, arms slung around each other's shoulders, both grinning widely at the camera. The boy beside him was someone Henry had not thought about in years, Daniel. Daniel had been his best friend, his confidant, the one person who understood him in a way no one else ever had. But their friendship had been more than that. There had been something deeper between them, something unspoken but undeniably real. Henry remembered the stolen glances, the accidental touches that lingered a moment too long, the way his heart had raced whenever Daniel was near. But those feelings, those desires, had been forbidden. They had no place in the world Henry had been raised in, a world where anything other than the traditional path was met with scorn and rejection. And so, Henry had done what he thought he had to do. He had buried those feelings deep inside, locked them away in a part of himself that he had vowed never to revisit. As he stared at the photo, the memories came flooding back, vivid and painful. He remembered the day it had all come to a head, the day he had made a choice that had haunted him ever since. He had pushed Daniel away, had severed their friendship with harsh words and cold indifference, just as he had done with Michael now. He had convinced himself that it was for the best, that he was doing what was right. But deep down, he had always known that he was running from the truth, from a part of himself he was too afraid to face. And now, after all these years, that truth was staring him in the face once again, embodied in the son he had tried so hard to mold into something he wasn't. The realization hit Henry like a physical blow, the weight of it almost too much to bear. He had become the very thing he had once feared, the enforcer of a rigid code that left no room for anything other than what was deemed acceptable. As he closed the album, Henry felt a deep sense of shame wash over him. How could he have done this to his own son, the boy he had sworn to protect and love unconditionally? How could he have allowed his own fears and insecurities to destroy the most important relationship in his life? But even as these thoughts plagued him, Henry's old defenses began to rise. He had spent a lifetime building walls around his heart, convincing himself that strength meant adhering to the values he had been taught. The idea of breaking those walls down, of confronting the feelings he had spent so long denying, was terrifying. The echo of his past reverberated through his mind, growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. He couldn't escape it, couldn't hide from it any longer. The memories of Daniel, of the choices he had made, were a mirror reflecting the reality he now faced with Michael. The pain he had inflicted on himself by denying who he was had now been passed on to his son, and the realization of that was almost too much to bear. Upstairs, Michael lay awake in bed, his mind replaying the events of the previous night. The pain of his father's rejection still burned in his chest, a wound that seemed to deepen with each passing moment. He had known this day would come, had always feared it, but nothing could have prepared him for the coldness in his father's eyes, the way he had been cast aside without a word. But as much as the pain tore at him, there was also a strange sense of relief. The secret he had carried for so long was no longer hidden. It was out in the open, and even though it had brought him nothing but heartache, there was a freedom in no longer having to pretend. For the first time in his life, Michael felt like he could breathe, even if the air was tinged with sorrow. As the day wore on, both Henry and Michael were left to grapple with the echoes of their pasts, each one haunted by the choices they had made and the paths they had taken. The silence in the house remained unbroken, a chasm that seemed to widen with each passing hour. And yet, within that silence, there was a growing awareness that something had to change, that the walls both father and son had built around themselves could not stand much longer. Henry knew that he couldn't continue to live this way, trapped by the ghosts of his past and the expectations he had imposed on himself and his son. But the path forward was unclear, shrouded in the same fear and uncertainty that had driven him to this point. The only thing he knew for certain was that the answers he sought could not be found in the rigid beliefs he had clung to for so long. As the day turned to evening, Henry found himself once again at the crossroads of his life, just as he had been all those years ago with Daniel. But this time, the stakes were even higher, the consequences of his choices more far-reaching. The echo of his forgotten past had come back to haunt him, and this time, there was no running away. As he stood at the window, watching the snow fall softly outside, Henry made a silent vow to himself. He didn't know how or even if he could repair the damage that had been done. But he knew that he couldn't let history repeat itself, couldn't allow his own fears to destroy the relationship with his son. It was time to face the truth, no matter how painful, and to find a way to bridge the gap that had opened between them. For both Henry and Michael, the echoes of the past were a reminder of the choices they had made, and the ones they still had to make. And as the night deepened, so did their resolve to confront the darkness within, and to find a way to heal the wounds that had been inflicted by years of silence and denial. Henry sat alone in his study, the old photo album still open on his desk. The images of his past stared back at him, each one a stark reminder of the choices he had made, the life he had led, and the truths he had buried. The air in the room felt heavy, as if the weight of his memories was pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. With a trembling hand, Henry reached for the stack of letters that lay beside the album. They were old, the paper yellowed and brittle with age, but the words written on them were as clear as the day they had been penned. Each letter was a piece of his past, a past he had tried so hard to forget. But now, those memories had come rushing back, bringing with them a flood of emotions that he could no longer suppress. He unfolded the first letter, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. It was from Daniel, the boy who had once been his closest friend, his confidant, his first love. The words were filled with a deep, aching longing, a love that had never been allowed to flourish, cut short by the harsh realities of the world they lived in. "Henry, my dear friend," the letter began. "I hope this letter finds you well, though I know that things between us have been strained. I've been thinking a lot about our last conversation, about the things we didn't say, and I can't help but feel that there's so much left unsaid. I miss you, Henry. I miss the way we used to be before everything became so complicated. I know it's wrong. I know it's something we can't talk about, but I can't pretend anymore. I love you, Henry, and I always will." Henry's vision blurred as tears filled his eyes, the pain of those words hitting him like a punch to the gut. He had never responded to that letter. Instead, he had done what he thought was right at the time. He had distanced himself from Daniel, pushed him away, and buried those feelings deep inside. He had chosen the path of least resistance, the path that would allow him to continue living the life expected of him, even if it meant sacrificing the love he had felt. He had told himself that it was for the best, that he was protecting himself, protecting Daniel from a world that would never understand them. But now, all these years later, he realized that he had been protecting no one. He had only succeeded in hurting the person he cared about most, and in the process, he had lost a part of himself. As he read through the other letters, each one more painful than the last, Henry felt the walls he had built around his heart begin to crumble. The truth that he had tried so hard to deny was now staring him in the face, and there was no escaping it. He had loved Daniel just as his son now loved someone of the same gender. And just like he had been afraid to embrace that love, he had expected Michael to do the same. The realization was like a knife twisting in his gut. He had become the very thing he had feared, an enforcer of the same rigid beliefs that had once caused him so much pain. And in doing so, he had driven a wedge between himself and his son, a wedge that might never be removed. But as painful as the truth was, Henry knew that he couldn't continue living a lie. He couldn't continue to hide from the past, from the mistakes he had made. He needed to confront them, to face the reality of who he was and what he had done. Only then could he begin to make amends, to try and heal the rift between himself and Michael. With a heavy heart, Henry gathered the letters and the album, his hands shaking as he placed them back in the box where they had been hidden for so long. He knew what he had to do, but the thought of it terrified him. He would have to tell Michael the truth, reveal the secrets he had kept buried for decades. And in doing so, he would have to confront the part of himself that he had tried so hard to forget. Upstairs, Michael was sitting on the edge of his bed, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The events of the past few days had left him feeling drained, both physically and emotionally. He had always known that his relationship with his father was complicated, but he had never imagined it would come to this. The silence between them had been unbearable, each passing day only deepening the chasm that had opened between them. Michael wanted to talk to his father to try and bridge the gap, but every time he thought about it, he was paralyzed by fear. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to make things right. But more than that, he was afraid of what his father might say in return. He had seen the look in Henry's eyes, the cold indifference that had cut through him like a knife. He had always feared his father's rejection, and now that it had finally come, he didn't know how to handle it. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, there was a soft knock on his door. Michael looked up, his heart skipping a beat as he heard his father's voice on the other side. "Michael, can I come in?" The words were hesitant, almost uncertain, and for a moment, Michael didn't know how to respond. But then he nodded, even though his father couldn't see him. "Yeah, come in." Henry opened the door and stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He stood there for a moment, as if unsure of what to do next, before finally walking over to the bed and sitting down beside his son. The silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. "Michael," Henry began, his voice low and strained, "I need to talk to you. There's something I need to tell you about my past." Michael looked at his father, surprised by the sudden openness in his tone. Henry had always been a man of few words, especially when it came to his own life. But now, there was a vulnerability in his voice that Michael had never heard before, a rawness that made him uneasy. "I know I haven't been the father you needed," Henry continued, his hands gripping the edge of the bed. "I know I've hurt you, pushed you away, and for that, I'm sorry. But there's something you don't know about me, something I've kept hidden for a long time." Michael frowned, unsure of where this was going. "Dad, what are you talking about?" Henry took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he was about to say. "When I was your age, I had a friend. His name was Daniel. We were close, closer than friends, really. We loved each other, but we couldn't be together. It wasn't allowed, it wasn't something that people could accept back then. So I pushed him away, just like I've been pushing you away. I was afraid of what people would say, afraid of losing everything I'd worked for." He paused, his voice cracking as the memories flooded back. "I thought I was doing the right thing, that I was protecting both of us. But all I did was hurt him, hurt myself, and now I see that I've been doing the same thing to you." Michael stared at his father, his mind reeling with the revelation. He had never imagined that his father, the man who had always been so rigid, so set in his ways, could have gone through something like this. It was almost too much to take in. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand," Henry said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I don't want to make the same mistakes with you that I made with Daniel. I don't want to lose you, Michael. You're my son, and I love you. I may not have shown it in the right way, but I do. Tears welled up in Michael's eyes as he listened to his father's confession, the pain and regret in Henry's voice cutting through him. For the first time in his life, he saw his father not as the stern, unyielding figure he had always known, but as a man who had his own struggles, his own demons. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Henry continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I just wanted you to know the truth. I'm sorry, Michael. I'm so sorry." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of Henry's words hanging in the air. And then, slowly, Michael reached out and took his father's hand in his. The gesture was small, but it spoke volumes. It was the first step towards healing, towards bridging the gap that had opened between them. "I'm sorry too, Dad," Michael whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I was afraid that you wouldn't understand." Henry squeezed his son's hand, his heart breaking at the pain in Michael's voice. "I know, son, I know, but we're going to get through this. Together." And for the first time in a long time, there was a glimmer of hope in the silence that followed. A hope that, despite everything, they could find a way to heal, to forgive, and to move forward together. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be more painful revelations, more difficult conversations. But for now, they had taken the first step. And sometimes that was the hardest part. As father and son sat together in the quiet room, the echoes of the past began to fade, replaced by the promise of a new beginning. One built on honesty, understanding, and, above all, love. The days that followed were a mix of tension and tentative steps toward reconciliation. Henry and Michael were both acutely aware of the fragile bond they were trying to rebuild, a bond that had been strained to the breaking point but had not yet shattered. The air in the Thompson household, once heavy with unspoken words and unresolved pain, now carried a different kind of weight, a cautious hope tinged with uncertainty. Henry found himself spending more time in the study, not to retreat into his thoughts as he had before, but to confront them. The letters from Daniel, the old photo album, they had become a kind of solace, a reminder of the man he had once been and the man he wanted to become. He would sit for hours, reading and rereading the letters, trying to glean from them some understanding, some wisdom that might help him bridge the gap between him and his son. Meanwhile, Michael was struggling with his own emotions. The revelation about his father's past had shaken him to his core. He had always seen Henry as the embodiment of the rigid moral code that had shaped his upbringing, unyielding, inflexible, and impossible to please. But now he was forced to confront the reality that his father was more complex than he had ever imagined. A man who had his own fears, his own regrets. Michael couldn't help but feel a deep sense of sadness for the young Henry, who had been forced to suppress his true self, just as Michael had tried to do. It was a cruel irony that the very thing Henry had once run from had now come full circle in his son's life. And yet, there was a strange comfort in knowing that his father understood, even if that understanding was born out of shared pain. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a soft shade of pink, Michael found himself standing outside the door to his father's study. He hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the doorknob, before finally summoning the courage to knock. "Come in," Henry's voice called from inside, weary but not unkind. Michael pushed the door open and stepped into the room. The familiar smell of old books and leather greeted him, and he saw his father sitting at the desk, the photo album open in front of him. Henry looked up, his eyes meeting Michael's with a mixture of surprise and apprehension. "Hey," Michael said softly, closing the door behind him. "Hey," Henry replied, his voice cautious. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Have a seat." Michael nodded and sat down, his eyes drifting to the album on the desk. The page was open to a photo of a young Henry and Daniel, their arms around each other, smiles on their faces. The image was bittersweet, a snapshot of a time when things were simpler, before the weight of the world had come crashing down on them. "Is that him?" Michael asked, nodding toward the photo. Henry glanced down at the picture, a small, sad smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah, that's Daniel," Michael studied the photo for a moment, trying to reconcile the image of the carefree young man with the father he had known all his life. It was strange seeing his father like this, vulnerable, exposed, but it was also humanizing, and for the first time Michael felt like he was seeing Henry not just as his father, but as a person with his own story, his own struggles. "You were happy," Michael said, more as an observation than a question. Henry nodded, his eyes distant as he remembered. "I was, for a while at least, but it didn't last. I couldn't let it last." Michael could hear the regret in his father's voice, the pain of a life lived in fear of judgment. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said quietly. Henry looked at his son, the sincerity in Michael's voice catching him off guard. "I'm sorry too, Michael. I'm sorry that I let my own fears, my own mistakes, affect you. I thought I was doing what was right, but I see now that all I did was push you away." Michael shook his head, tears brimming in his eyes. "I've been so angry with you for so long, Dad. I wanted so badly for you to accept me, to love me for who I am. But I was so afraid that you wouldn't, that you couldn't." Henry reached across the desk, placing his hand on top of Michael's. "I do love you, Michael. I've always loved you. I just didn't know how to show it. I was afraid. Afraid of what people would think. Afraid of losing you, afraid of losing myself. But I don't want to be afraid anymore." Michael squeezed his father's hand, the tears finally spilling over. "I don't want to be afraid either." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the connection between them growing stronger, the walls that had once separated them beginning to crumble. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was a start that both father and son knew was long overdue. "I've been thinking," Henry said after a while, his voice thoughtful, "about Daniel, about what happened between us. I don't want to make the same mistakes with you, Michael. I don't want to spend the rest of my life regretting what I didn't say, what I didn't do. I want to be there for you, in the way I couldn't be for him." Michael nodded, understanding the depth of what his father was saying. "I want that too, Dad. I want us to be a family again." Henry smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that Michael hadn't seen in years. "We'll get there, son. It's going to take time, but we'll get there." They spent the rest of the evening talking, really talking, for the first time in years. They shared stories, memories, fears, and hopes. They laughed and cried together, and in those moments, they began to rebuild the connection that had been lost for so long. As the night grew late, and the house fell quiet once more, Henry and Michael both knew that there was still a long road ahead. But they also knew that they wouldn't be walking it alone. They had each other, and that was enough. The next morning, as the first light of dawn crept into the study, Henry found himself looking at the photo of Daniel one last time before closing the album and placing it back in its box. He knew that the past would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined him. He had a future to look forward to now, a future with his son, a future where they could both be themselves without fear. And for the first time in a long time, Henry felt at peace. The tentative peace that had begun to form between Henry and Michael was fragile, like a delicate thread stretched too thin. Both father and son were aware of the unspoken words that still hung in the air, the unresolved emotions that simmered just below the surface. It was only a matter of time before those emotions would demand to be faced, and when that time came, it would either strengthen their bond or break it entirely. The opportunity for that confrontation came sooner than either of them expected. It was a crisp, clear morning, and the town was slowly waking up to the sounds of life beginning to stir. Cars starting, children laughing as they hurried to catch the school bus, the distant hum of traffic. Inside the Thompson house, however, the atmosphere was tense. Michael had decided to stay home for the day, needing some time to process everything that had happened. Henry, too, had taken the day off work, sensing that they were on the brink of a crucial moment in their relationship. As they sat at the breakfast table, the silence between them was heavy, each man lost in his own thoughts. The clinking of silverware on plates was the only sound, punctuated by the occasional sigh or awkward glance. Finally, Michael couldn't take it anymore. He put down his fork and looked at his father, his heart pounding in his chest. "Dad, we need to talk," Henry, who had been staring absently at his coffee cup, looked up, meeting his son's gaze. He saw the determination in Michael's eyes, and he knew that the moment they had been avoiding was finally here. "Yes, we do," he agreed, his voice calm but laced with apprehension. Michael took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I know you're trying, and I appreciate it, but there's still so much that we haven't talked about, so much that I need to understand. I need to know why, Dad. Why did you push me away? Why couldn't you accept me for who I am?" Henry felt a pang of guilt as he listened to his son's words. He had been preparing for this conversation, but now that it was happening, he found it difficult to find the right words. "Michael," he began slowly, "I wish I had a simple answer for you. I wish I could tell you that it was because of my upbringing or my beliefs or the pressure from society. But the truth is, I don't really know. All I know is that I was afraid. Afraid of what it would mean for you, for our family, and for me." Michael's eyes narrowed, his voice filled with frustration. "Afraid of what, Dad? That people would judge us? That you'd lose respect in the community? Or were you afraid of what it might say about you?" Henry winced at the sharpness in Michael's tone, but he knew his son had every right to be angry. "All of those things," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I was afraid of how it would reflect on me as a father, as a man. I was taught that certain things were unacceptable, that they were a sign of weakness, and I didn't want to face the possibility that I had failed somehow." Michael shook his head, a mix of sadness and anger in his eyes. "But you didn't fail, Dad. The only failure was in not accepting me, in not loving me unconditionally. I needed you, and you turned your back on me." The words cut deep, and Henry felt his heart ache with the weight of his son's pain. He had always prided himself on being strong, on being a protector, but in this moment, he felt more helpless than he ever had before. "I know, Michael," he said softly, his voice trembling, "and I'm so sorry for that. I let my fears and my pride get in the way of being the father you needed. I thought I was protecting you by trying to change you, but all I did was push you away." Michael looked at his father, his expression softening slightly. "Why didn't you tell me about Daniel sooner? Why did you keep that part of your life hidden from me?" Henry sighed, rubbing his temples as he tried to gather his thoughts. "Because I was ashamed," he confessed. "Ashamed of who I was, of what I felt. I spent my entire life trying to be someone I wasn't, trying to fit into a mold that I thought was the only way to be. I buried that part of myself so deep that I almost forgot it existed. And when I saw you struggling with the same thing, I didn't know how to help you. I was afraid that if I acknowledged your feelings, I'd have to confront my own, and I wasn't ready to do that." Michael felt a lump form in his throat as he listened to his father's words. He had always imagined that Henry's disapproval was rooted in a lack of understanding, in ignorance or stubbornness. But now he realized that it was far more complicated than that. His father's rejection had been born out of his own unresolved pain, his own struggle to come to terms with who he was. "Dad," Michael said quietly, "you didn't have to face this alone. I wish you had told me sooner. We could have figured it out together." Henry's eyes filled with tears, and he reached across the table, taking his son's hand in his. "I know that now, Michael. I'm just so sorry that it took me this long to realize it. I wasted so much time, and I hurt you in the process. But I want to make it right. I want to be the father you deserve, the father who loves you no matter what." Michael squeezed his father's hand, feeling the sincerity in his words. "I want that too, Dad. I want us to be a family again. But it's going to take time. I need to heal from everything that's happened, and I need to know that you're really committed to accepting me for who I am." Henry nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "I am, Michael. I promise you I am. I've already lost so much because of my own stubbornness and fear. I don't want to lose you too." The room fell silent again, but this time, the silence was different. It was a silence filled with understanding, with the promise of a new beginning. Both father and son knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that there would be more conversations like this, more moments of raw emotion and vulnerability. But they also knew that they were ready to face it together, to rebuild their relationship on a foundation of honesty and love. As they sat together, the weight of their shared pain began to lift, replaced by a sense of hope. They had finally confronted the emotions that had been festering for so long, and in doing so, they had taken the first step toward healing. It wasn't a perfect resolution. There were still wounds to be healed, still trust to be rebuilt, but it was a start. Later that evening, as the sun set and the house was bathed in the soft glow of twilight, Henry and Michael sat in the living room, sharing stories from their past, laughing and reminiscing. For the first time in a long time, the tension between them had eased, replaced by a growing bond that neither of them had expected. And as the night wore on, they both knew that they had taken a crucial step forward. The confrontation of emotions had been painful, but it had also been necessary. It had allowed them to see each other not just as father and son, but as two people who had their own struggles, their own fears, and their own desires. They had a long way to go, but they were on the right path. And for now, that was enough. As the last light of day faded from the sky, Henry and Michael sat side by side, the warmth of their connection slowly beginning to mend the wounds that had once seemed impossible to heal. The days following their heartfelt confrontation were marked by a new sense of openness in the Thompson household. Henry and Michael were both making a conscious effort to bridge the gap that had formed between them over the years, taking small steps toward rebuilding their relationship. It was not easy. Decades of pain and misunderstanding could not be undone overnight, but there was a sense of hope, a belief that they were moving in the right direction. Henry found himself reflecting more and more on his past, not just on his relationship with Daniel, but on the way he had lived his life up until this point. He realized that much of his rigidity, his insistence on adhering to traditional values, had been a way to protect himself from the vulnerability he had felt as a young man. But now, with the truth out in the open, he felt a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to truly feel, to grieve the loss of his friendship with Daniel, to mourn the years he had spent hiding from his true self, and to embrace the love he had for his son without reservation. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a soft shade of purple, Henry made a decision. He needed to visit Daniel's grave, to say goodbye in a way he never had the chance to when Daniel was alive. It felt like a necessary step in his journey toward redemption, a way to finally lay the past to rest so that he could fully embrace the future with Michael. "Michael," Henry said one evening as they sat together in the living room, "I've been thinking I'd like to visit Daniel's grave. I think it's something I need to do. Would you come with me?" Michael looked at his father, surprised by the request. He had never heard his father speak so openly about his past, let alone suggest something as emotionally charged as visiting the grave of a lost love. But he also saw the sincerity in Henry's eyes, the desire to make amends not just with him, but with himself. "Of course, Dad," Michael replied softly. "I'd be honored to go with you." The following weekend, they made the drive to the small town where Daniel had been buried. It was a quiet place, nestled in the countryside, with rows of tombstones stretching out beneath the shade of ancient oak trees. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth, and the only sound was the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. Henry led the way to Daniel's grave, his steps slow and deliberate. When they reached it, he stood for a moment, staring at the headstone that bore Daniel's name, his heart heavy with the weight of everything he had left unsaid. Michael watched as his father knelt beside the grave, his hands trembling slightly as he reached out to touch the cool stone. He could see the pain etched in Henry's features, the regret that had been buried for so long finally coming to the surface. "Daniel," Henry began, his voice breaking, "I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for what I did, for the way I pushed you away. I thought I was doing what was right, but all I did was hurt you, and hurt myself. I've lived with that regret every day, and it's taken me too long to finally say this. But I miss you. I miss the friendship we had, the love we shared. I wish I had been brave enough to stand by you, to stand by us." Tears welled up in Henry's eyes, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. He simply knelt there, his head bowed, the grief he had kept locked away for so long finally spilling out. Michael stepped forward, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. "Dad, it's okay. You're doing the best you can. That's what matters." Henry looked up at his son, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Michael. I just wish I could have told him this while he was still alive. I wish I could have told him how much he meant to me." Michael nodded, understanding the depth of his father's pain. "I think he knew, Dad. Even if you couldn't say it then, I think he knew." They stood together in silence for a few moments longer, the weight of the past slowly beginning to lift. There was a sense of closure in the air, a feeling that this was the first step in a long journey toward healing. As they walked back to the car, Henry felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He had finally confronted the ghosts of his past, had finally acknowledged the truth he had been running from for so long. And in doing so, he had taken the first step toward redemption, not just for himself, but for the relationship he was trying to rebuild with his son. The drive home was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence, one that spoke of understanding and mutual respect. For the first time in a long time, Henry felt that he and Michael were on the same page, that they were moving forward together. That night, as they sat together in the living room, Michael turned to his father with a thoughtful expression. "Dad, I've been thinking, what if we found a way to honor Daniel's memory? Maybe we could do something together, something that would help other people who might be going through the same things we did." Henry looked at his son, surprised by the suggestion. "What do you have in mind?" "Well," Michael began, "there are a lot of kids out there who feel like they don't have anyone to turn to, who are scared of being who they are because of what their parents or community might think. What if we started some kind of support group or a foundation, something that could help those kids and their families? We could share our story, show them that it's okay to be who they are, and that there's always a way to find acceptance and love." Henry was silent for a moment, considering the idea. The thought of sharing his story, of opening up about his past and his mistakes, was daunting. But at the same time, he knew that it was important, that it could make a real difference in people's lives. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Michael," Henry said finally, his voice filled with conviction. "I think it's exactly what we need to do." And so, they began to make plans. Plans to honor Daniel's memory, to share their story, and to help others who might be struggling with the same issues. It was a daunting task, but it was one they were determined to see through. As they worked together, father and son, they found that the process of planning and creating something positive from their pain brought them closer than they had ever been. There were still difficult days, still moments of tension and unresolved emotions, but there was also a growing sense of purpose, a belief that they were on the right path. In the weeks that followed, they started to reach out to others in the community, to share their story and to gather support for their cause. And as they did, they began to see the impact their efforts were having, the lives they were touching, the people they were helping. For Henry, it was a chance at redemption, a way to make amends for the mistakes of his past. And for Michael, it was a way to find meaning in the pain he had endured, to turn his struggles into something positive. Together, they were creating a legacy, not just for themselves, but for Daniel, and for everyone who had ever felt alone or afraid. And in doing so, they were finding healing not just for their relationship, but for themselves. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Henry and Michael continued to work side by side, building something that was more than just a foundation. It was a testament to the power of love, forgiveness, and redemption. And in the end, it was that love, that forgiveness, that brought them both the peace they had been searching for. The road ahead was still long, still filled with challenges, but they were no longer walking it alone. They had each other, and they had the memory of Daniel to guide them. It was enough. As the foundation took shape and their lives began to find a new rhythm, Henry and Michael discovered that their shared project was not only a way to honor Daniel's memory, but also a path toward deeper healing. The days were filled with meetings, planning sessions, and outreach efforts, each one bringing them closer to their goal of creating a safe space for those who needed it most. The process was therapeutic for both of them, allowing them to channel their pain into something meaningful. As the months passed, word of the foundation spread throughout the community. The response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life reached out, sharing their stories, offering their support, and expressing gratitude for the work Henry and Michael were doing. The foundation quickly became a beacon of hope for those struggling with acceptance, and its impact was felt far beyond the small town where it had started. Despite the progress they were making, both Henry and Michael knew that there was still one final step they needed to take. One last conversation that would truly solidify their bond and allow them to move forward without the shadow of the past hanging over them. It was a conversation that had been building since the day Henry had first opened up to Michael about Daniel, and they both knew it was time. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when Michael approached his father in the kitchen. Henry was preparing a simple lunch, his movements calm and deliberate. The sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the room, and for a moment, Michael hesitated, unsure of how to begin. But then he reminded himself that they had already come so far. This was the last piece of the puzzle. "Dad," Michael began, his voice steady, "there's something I need to talk to you about." Henry looked up from the counter, sensing the seriousness in Michael's tone. He set down the knife he was using to chop vegetables and turned to face his son, giving him his full attention. "Of course, Michael. What is it?" Michael took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "We've come a long way, you and I. We've worked through a lot of the pain, and I'm so grateful for everything we've been able to build together. But there's still something I need to know, something I've been struggling with since you told me about Daniel." Henry's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his expression neutral, nodding for Michael to continue. "Why didn't you fight for him?" Michael asked, his voice tinged with both curiosity and sadness. "Why didn't you try to make it work, to find a way to be together, despite everything? I know it was a different time, but you loved him, Dad. Why didn't you fight for that?" Henry felt a lump form in his throat as he considered the question. He had asked himself the same thing countless times over the years, but hearing it from his son made the reality of his past choices all the more poignant. "Michael," Henry began, choosing his words carefully, "I've asked myself that question every day since I lost Daniel. At the time, I thought I was doing the right thing. I was young, scared, and desperate to fit into the mold that had been set for me by my family, my community, and society as a whole. I didn't have the courage to stand up for what I really wanted, for who I really was. I was afraid that if I fought for Daniel, I would lose everything else. My family's respect, my future, my identity as I understood it." Henry paused, his voice growing heavy with emotion. "But the truth is, I did lose everything that really mattered. I lost Daniel, and I lost a part of myself that I've never been able to fully recover. It took me decades to understand that the only thing worth fighting for is love, and by the time I realized that, it was too late. I made the wrong choice, Michael, and I've lived with that regret ever since." Michael listened intently, his heart aching for the young man his father had once been, the man who had been too afraid to fight for the love that could have brought him true happiness. He could see now that Henry's rigid beliefs, his fear of the unknown, had not only cost him Daniel but had also cast a long shadow over their relationship. "I'm sorry, Dad," Michael said softly. "I'm sorry you had to go through that, and I'm sorry that I didn't understand sooner. I know now that your rejection of me wasn't about me at all. It was about your own pain, your own unresolved feelings. I wish I could have been there for you, to help you through it." Henry's eyes filled with tears, and he reached out to take Michael's hand. "You're here for me now, Michael, and that's what matters. We can't change the past, but we can learn from it, and we can make sure that no one else has to go through what we did." Michael nodded, squeezing his father's hand. "You're right. We've already started making a difference, and I'm proud of the work we're doing. But more than that, I'm proud of you, Dad, for having the courage to face your past and for fighting for our relationship now. That means everything to me." Henry felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over him, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to truly believe that he could be forgiven, not just by Michael but by himself as well. "I'm proud of you too, Michael. You've shown me what it means to be brave, to be true to yourself, even when it's hard. You've taught me more than I could ever teach you, and I'm so grateful to have you in my life." They stood there for a moment, hands clasped, the weight of their shared journey settling over them like a warm embrace. The truth had finally been spoken. The last barriers between them had fallen, and the path forward was clear. As they released each other's hands, Henry felt a sense of liberation, as if a great burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He knew that the road ahead would still have its challenges, but he also knew that they would face them together, as a family. The foundation continued to grow, and with it, so did the bond between Henry and Michael. They became a source of strength for one another, drawing on their shared experiences to help others who were struggling with their own identities and relationships. The work they were doing was making a real difference, and with each success, they felt a renewed sense of purpose. One day, as they were wrapping up a particularly emotional meeting with a group of parents who were learning to accept their LGBTQ+ children, Henry turned to Michael and said, "I think Daniel would be proud of what we're doing." Michael smiled, a bittersweet expression on his face. "I think he would be too, Dad, and I think he'd be proud of you for finding the courage to live your truth, even if it took a little longer than you might have liked." Henry nodded, a tear slipping down his cheek as he thought of the man who had once been his whole world. "Thank you, Michael. That means more to me than you'll ever know." As they left the meeting and stepped out into the crisp autumn air, Henry felt a sense of peace that he had never known before. The truth, once a source of fear and shame, had become a beacon of hope, a guide that would lead them both toward a brighter future. And as they walked side by side, father and son, Henry knew that they had finally found their way home. Thank you very much for listening to this story. Comment below what you thought of the ending and from which city you're listening to us. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, click on the next story that's appearing on your screen now. Leave your like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a huge community that shares inspiring stories together. See you soon.